Greetings. Welcome. This is a live broadcast of Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is the summertime of 91 AD. We're quite confident that we can speculate about the 21st century because we're very secure here in the 1st century AD. Domitian remains a very unpopular figure in Rome, but that's far away. And by far, I mean in the 1st century AD. It takes weeks for to get here and would take months for us to get to Rome, and we're not traveling. We are, however, enjoying ourselves on the eve of conversations between two presidents in the 21st century. It's loaded with irony, and part of the challenge for Germanicus and myself is to get to the point and not be just ironical. However, we're told the emperor of the American Empire, that would be Donald Trump, has agreed to meet the king of the Russian Empire, Putin, in Alaska, which at one point, you will all remember, was a Russian possession, is no longer a Russian possession, though I'm sure they'd like it back. And the topic is Ukraine. Yes, it's that strange. They're meeting in Alaska to talk about Ukraine. At some point, there's been mention that Zelensky might be welcomed, but I can't imagine. Immediately, because Germanicus and I have history about another occasion where two emperors, one for the American Empire and a king for the Russian Empire, did not meet, but they had surrogates meeting all the time. And that's the Vietnam War. It is the moment to talk about what happened in 1968. Lyndon Johnson, surprising everyone, including his closest counselors, decided in late March 1968 to drop out of the presidency and announce peace talks between the U.S. and North Vietnam. Peace talks based on the war in Vietnam. And those peace talks were to begin immediately. Mr. Johnson announced, I'm ordering a cessation of the bombing that the U.S. had been doing for years, and the peace talks began. Those peace talks were unsuccessful until another bombing, Symmetry, in the Christmas of 1972, and the war finally came to a ceasefire conclusion in the winter of 73. In the spring of 74, 75, the North Vietnamese launched an offensive, quite in violation of the Treaty of 73, overran the South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, captured Saigon, and there began the torture of what was left of the Saigon government and the tragedy of Vietnam in 1975. We, however, are at the beginning. And so there's history here that we're not going to see a conclusion of these talks about Ukraine for years. History doesn't repeat itself, but there's a popular proverb that says it rhymes. All the elements are in place. America feeding into the Ukraine war with supplies and logistics, the way Russia fed into the Vietnam War with supplies and logistics. China sitting, playing both sides, doesn't want Russia to lose, wants to negotiate a good trade deal with the U.S. South Vietnam, nobody cared about it. Nobody. That's why I wasn't invited to the talks. Ukraine, well, it's hard to say nobody cares about it, but it's not number 1 or number 10 or number 50 on the minds of the American people. So I turned to Germanicus. I don't have a direct analogy to Germanicus, but I do have elements of the war between empires, and the surrogate battlefield is Ukraine. So in these next days, what are you watching for? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. The meeting in Alaska is very resonant or ironical, as you say, because in fact, when the U.S. purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire, it was a sort of a seal of what amounted to a de facto alliance. Russia had intervened on behalf of the Union, the beleaguered Union during the Civil War, and it helped to prevent Britain and France from intervening in that war. And there were tremendously close relations as a result between Russia and the US for the next 25 years. And in fact, Russia had to essentially bribe congressmen to the tune of 20 or 30 million dollars in today's money in order to get the Congress to buy Alaska. Russia was in deep financial straits at the time. But the fact is that there's a little remembrance of that in the meeting taking place in Alaska. And I'm not sure that that will carry over, but the fact is that it is a metaphor for a different relationship that the U.S. had with Russia a century and a half ago. And the truth is that, like Mr. Nixon, after 1968, saddled with Vietnam, trying to bring the war to an end, as he called it, peace with honor, spent the next several years owning the war and becoming essentially submerged by it. And it must be on the mind of Mr. Trump that this is the last thing that he wants to do. And the war could easily move in its dynamic impetus in the direction of it becoming Mr. Trump's war, which would really be terrible, because were the war to last another 2 or 3 years, it would be a terrible defeat for the U.S. and NATO. I think, sensing this, and I'm hoping he senses this, and I'm fairly sure he does because of the situation right now on the front, that it should be on the uppermost part of Mr. Trump's mind that this is an opportunity to try and extricate himself. And I emphasize the man, Mr. Trump, because he does not want to be saddled with the judgment of history. And so I think we'll have to see how he can turn this to his advantage, because just as Nixon going into negotiations with North Vietnam was in a terribly weak position, so it is with Mr. Trump. He doesn't have any cards, and he loves to talk about cards, but there's no real leverage that he has. So the trick, the magical misdirection, like a wizard, that he would have to pull off would be to somehow give in to Russia without appearing like a loser. And he would have to do that in a way that would circumvent all of the strenuous, bleating objections on the part of NATO countries and Ukraine. That's a tall order.
Let me check off what was demanded in 68, 69 by North Vietnam. They demanded an immediate halt to the bombing. They demanded a withdrawal of all American troops. They demanded an election to be held within a set period of time. And Key, the two smart crooks who ruled South Vietnam, could not participate in the election. They demanded all that, and they wanted money as well. 68, Johnson said, I can't do that. Why? He couldn't get two to agree. Johnson couldn't get two to agree, despite their meeting in Hawaii. The two just was more militant than Johnson felt. Nixon couldn't get two to agree either, but Nixon played other games having to do with splitting China and Russia from each other and using détente as a carrot for Moscow and sending Kissinger in to meet Mao and then setting up the meeting in the winter of 72. All of that was Nixon and Kissinger's bigger game. I don't sense that Trump right now is playing a bigger game. He might be. I'm just mentioning that Johnson let two veto the concessions. And
yes.
know whether Trump would let Zelensky veto the concessions. What do they look like? Withdrawal of all NATO forces, no NATO, Donbass, Crimea, maybe even Sevastopol. I don't know. All of that might be part of the treaty, plus money, and the Russians maintain their present lines. I don't know if they want the parts of the provinces they haven't occupied. I can't tell. But all of that, plus promises that no NATO ever and no rearming of Ukraine is. So the question to you, Germanicus, is the emperor ready to give that amount of concessions to Moscow?
It's a tough choice.
Yeah.
If he concedes, he can bring the war to an end. But that involves circumventing and even dismissing Mr. Zelensky.
Will he
And
do
it
that?
also,
Will he do that?
I
Johnson,
don't know. I mean, Johnson was weak in the sense that he could not operate effectively on the international stage. Mr. Trump has no problem, as we saw when he dressed Mr. Zelensky down
right.
in the Oval Office. But the point is, he has to be steely and hard-hearted enough to basically discard Zelensky and essentially dismiss the European vassals bleeding and say that here's how we're going to go. And of course, I don't need to say it, but most people aren't aware of it. It means all of the oblasts, all of the territory
Yes.
being offered to Russia.
Maybe even Odessa, because that's part of Novorossiya. What about an election? Because part of the demand out of Moscow is we need new elections to get rid of Zelensky.
That could be a way to do it, but it would have to be tough. I mean, the U.S. was willing to kill the head of Vietnam, Mr. Diem, in 1963-4. And the fact is that it's going to take that level of hard-hearted decision making to bring the war to an end. The downside with nothing coming out of these talks, of course, is that Mr. Trump would look weak, and things would continue with Russia going from strength to strength on the battlefield, and that would just erode Trump's strength, and there'd be all of the clamorous neocons in Washington and all of the tremulous but aggressive European honchos pushing him to get back in the war against Russia. And that would be a disaster for him, and he knows it. His entire motivation now as emperor is to bring the war to an end so he can get his Nobel Prize. And I have to believe that he's weighed things in the balance and must, as a result, be willing to take some risks. Otherwise, everything could come apart for him.
Let's go back to 1967. We have a time machine available to us. Germanicus is Michael Playhouse. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're in Londinium in our wine bar by the Thames. The centurions are gathered around. We learned last week the centurions are fascinated. These are all retired centurions, 25 years. They get land, they get families, and they live here with us very happily. Rough, tough characters, but now they're interested in Vietnam. They don't know it. They don't know too much about it except for what we tell them. They're aware of the fact that we can see it always, and they listen because they have lessons from their times in the legions across the empire. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. When we come back, John Wayne, the Green Berets, 1967, a window on the time that we're talking about. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here, and we're in our time machine looking at the 21st century and on the eve of what we're told to be conversations between the Emperor of the American Empire and the King of the Russian Empire in Alaska. But we turn to 1967 because therein lies lessons learned and lessons not learned by the American Empire. Westmoreland was commanding McPhee in Saigon. Lyndon Johnson was president. They were still launching operations against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, thinking that casualty counts were going to win the war, attrition. And they would launch these operations with helicopter and artillery supremacy, and the North Vietnamese learned how to manage it. They learned, in other words, the same mistake that you can always make in a war, forgetting that the enemy has a vote, an agency, and learns. But we're returning to 1967 not for the actual memory of those battles, but for a movie you can all see on Prime. It's everywhere if you look for it. It's called The Green Berets. John Wayne made the movie, he directed the movie. It's based on a work of fiction from 1965. The work is based upon the concept of Green Berets, special soldiers who are trained in languages and medicine and explosives and combat, magical men who can be dropped into circumstances that don't require major combat units. It was an ambition of the 20th century for America. We were so superior, we thought we could come up with specialists who could be both USAID and DOD at the same time, something like that. Well, the movie was made at Fort Benning, Georgia. And John Wayne had the complete cooperation of the Department of Defense, of Lyndon Johnson. And the movie is a representation of what the opinion was at the time for those who believed that Vietnam was a war that could be won. Or as Westmoreland would say now and again, victory's right around the corner. He would say this. These men can seem simple-minded. They're not. They're veterans, junior officers during the Second War, senior officers during the Vietnam War, watching it build momentum. And I urge you all to look at it. It's hard viewing. It's more than 2 hours, much more than 2 hours. I think it's close to 2.5 hours long. It's made in a fashion that presents the American side as virtuous, long-suffering, generous, brave Boy Scouts. And the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are pictured as devils in black pajamas, evil people. It goes on for more than 2 hours. And watching it again, I haven't watched it. I saw it in the summer of 68, when it came out. It was made in 67, came in the summer of 68. And I can remember thinking at the time in the half-empty theater, more than half-empty, it was bare, and I was on Cape Cod watching it there, summertime, that this is a very strange story. I remember thinking that, but I was 20 years old, and so I didn't have geopolitical thoughts. Now when I watch the movie, I think, we can't see the propaganda around us today, as I couldn't see it in 68. But 60 years later, you can see all of it. So, Germanicus, I turn to you about this idea of the propaganda that's convinced us one way or t'other. The way Green Berets was based upon, the whole thing was make-believe. All of it, every moment of it. What's around us now, and what are we missing about the situation between America, China, and Russia today that 60 years from now they will laugh at us?
There is an acute counterpoint to be seen between the Green Berets in its time and the freshet, the cascade of propaganda surrounding the Ukraine war. And the counterpoint is this. In 1968, the American media had turned against the war. And as a result, movies like The Green Berets, which was a terrible movie, and running on empty, working from World War II propaganda that had really just dribbled away, could not stand up to all of the anti-war fervor that actually the U.S. media was stoking during this period. And as a result, it looked quite correctly as awful as half-baked World War II propaganda. And today, in the war in Ukraine, we have a very different situation in which you had, after 2022, an administration, the imperial court, and the entire mainstream media operating in unison, almost like something out of the Third Reich. Everything was lockstep in terms of messaging, and it presented Americans with this cascade of propaganda about the Ukraine war that in actuality was as false, as clunky, as tone deaf as the Green Berets were in terms of the Vietnam War. But Americans had no alternative. Americans saw this glorious war rather than seeing the actual reality that undergirded the war, the falseness, the attack on Russia, the corruption in Ukraine, the inevitability of a Russian victory. It was all submerged by this huge wave of buoyant propaganda that just celebrated the glory of Ukraine. Slava Ukrainia. It was just amazing. And if it hadn't been for the fact that social media had emerged at that point, which actually provided an alternative perspective, Americans wouldn't have been able to see the falseness of this propaganda. So it did eventually sink in, and it has, but it took 3.5 years. And what's really interesting is that in the Green Beret world of Vietnam and the anti-war sentiment that was emerging, driven by the media, the war fell apart. But when the media and the imperial court, the government, are pushing a war, then they have the capacity to, at least for a time, to corral people into embracing a complete falsehood, a reality that is in fact a fantasy. And this has been the great crime of this war, is that we can see in the Ukraine war how the US government, NATO allies, and their media machine could essentially create a propaganda vision that has led to the destruction of a country, Ukraine, for nothing.
Do you think the media today, I'm thinking of Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, along with New York and Washington, do you think they're going to sustain Zelensky, or will they let him go?
Zelensky is a durable figure. He's shown that. But there are limits to his capacity to survive. And when the word comes down from the emperor that he's out, then he's out. I don't think European leaders, in large part because they're vassals and ultimately submissive to the U.S., will stand in the way if the U.S. decides that he has to go. And frankly, if there is to be a resolution to the war, he has to go. And at some point, it will be easier to present that outcome because of the massive corruption um, that he represents, the billions that he's stolen with his regime comrades, and so it isn't a hard thing to do to get rid of him because of everything that he represents and has done to Ukraine. But someone has to make the decision. And I believe that the war can only end when you have a regime change, you clear the air, you have a new situation.
Oh, we'll put in somebody sympathetic to the Moscow position. Yes, but now there is that NATO card, and NATO says today Kiev, tomorrow Estonia, and I'm entertaining the possibility that in letting Zelensky go, they'll turn on Trump if he tries to give up NATO.
I don't think that Mr. Trump will give up NATO. I think what will happen is that there will have to be some kind of internal reckoning in which this fantasy of Russia as a threat invading NATO and attacking the Baltics will be put to bed. Because, in fact, it doesn't really exist. Russia is not in a position to do anything. I mean, it has been flat out fighting Ukraine, and it is prevailing against Ukraine, but at a really quite substantial cost. Russia is in no position to threaten Europe. And it's like the boy who cried wolf. Someone has to say, hey, this is, or you can bring up the cliche of the emperor's new clothes. I mean, there's nothing there. And someone has to do it, though.
Germanicus, you're making sense that doesn't matter when it comes to jingoism. And
no.
And NATO and the neocons and the newspapers can all easily decide that they're going to hold on to Zelensky because after him, NATO goes. I mean, they can do it. I agree with you if the emperor has an opportunity here. I agree with that. And Johnson had an opportunity and Nixon had an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
Other concerns. Nixon certainly concerned himself with dividing Russia and China.
He was successful. I mean, yeah. I don't think Trump has the kind of strategic acumen to do that. But if he chooses to move, things can happen. But if he is immobilized, he will suffer.
Okay. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I agree that this is an opportunity for Mr. Trump to make a clean sweep. Zelensky go on elections, Donbass to Russia, and then détente. It can happen. It's not unrealistic.
Right.
It would not please the what do they call themselves? The Never Trumpers or something like that. It would not please them, but it would be quickly forgotten. How long would it take for the word Ukraine to disappear from the front page? About a week? A month?
Yeah. The jingoists are the problem. I mean, the jingoists were a problem for Britain in 1878 when Britain almost went to war with Russia. But the fact is that cooler heads prevailed. Disraeli, Gladstone, they said no. Someone has to say no to these jingoists because they are a 1,000 loose cannons on the deck of the ship of state.
I like the number 1,000. Let's turn to that, Germanicus, because there's talk these days that when America loses a war, it means that it's weak and a transition empire and not holding on. There's the possibility that we've got a shot at breaking the Roman record. When we come back, Germanicus, Gaius, Londinium, enjoying ourselves. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. This is the Friends Society, and Germanicus is here. He is enjoying himself as I am on a summer's evening, speculating about what happened in 1968. And does it apply? Are there lessons learned for what is about to happen between the American Empire and the Russian Empire? Negotiation in Alaska to start with. However, there's also the question of the empire and how long it can last. Every time America runs up against another obstacle in its stubborn way, there are doubters out there who say the empire is losing the authority it once had in 1945. It's frittered away, it's under what it means to be in charge. It's going to become just another European stooge, or some remarks like that. Germanicus, because I've been reading about Cicero again, and his defense of the Republic, a lot of sentimentality. This is that transition moment between the Republic with the Senate and the Empire with Augustus. Because I've been reading about it, I got to thinking about the American Empire and how flexible it is when it comes up against obstacles. I don't know when you agree to date the beginning of the empire. I'm comfortable with saying it was born as an idea in the 18th century, an experiment. It did not assert its authority until sometime in the early 20th century. I don't know what date. It had great potential, and the Europeans saw it. And so now we're in the first 100 years, somewhere around there. Do we have 1,500 years in us? After reading Cicero, I think we do, because there's that magical argument from the 18th century that continues. What is your measure?
When we look at the Punic Wars, everyone wonders how the Romans survived the terrible calamities inflicted upon them by Hannibal. And the truth is that Italy, which Rome had managed to suborn and colonize and bring into alliance by the 3rd century, was one of the most populous places on earth. And they were in a position to use that manpower effectively, and they did. One of the reasons that Rome was able to pull together the whole known world was that manpower. I mean, Egypt had wealth, but Rome had manpower. And the U.S. is in a very similar situation. The U.S. is a gigantic empire, and it may not have as many people as China, but within 20, 30, 40 years, China will be steeply in population decline, and the U.S. will still be growing. And so the U.S. will go from being 1/5 the population of China to being half the population of China. And the U.S. population is well configured to continue to be successful. In other words, the U.S., as long as the U.S. is well managed, and that's something of an if, because as we have seen at various times, when a government mismanages the country and things begin to decline or not come apart, but there are fragilities that are exposed. People get very nervous, but the U.S. can pull itself quickly back together, as it did after Carter with the Reagan administration, and as we can see today with Mr. Trump potentially. You have a very robust and durable empire, and with all of its dependence, and its dependence cover much of the world. We have the Atlantic, we have the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore even. Much of Europe is dependent on us. This is an incredibly powerful entity. And the fact that we're not the sole world power or the quote-unquote superpower is irrelevant, because we are really the dominant force in world affairs. And
what about the story of Germanicus, the story of once upon a time, there were men who believed that they could put authority into a constitution and make promises to their colleagues, and we'll call it democracy. What about that story? Does that sustain itself for 1,500 years?
You focused on the real issue. The real strength of the U.S. is its constitution and the unswerving fidelity of its people to that constitution. Were the U.S. Constitution as the regnant document, more like a kind of a Bible or Quran for American identity, were that to be compromised and to be corrupted, then that would potentially spell that would begin the process of decline and unraveling. But what, in spite of all of the tremendous conflicts that we see on the surface and the battles and whether it's rioting or tussles over the interpretation of articles in the Constitution, that is a healthy sign. As long as the Constitution remains the centerpiece of our identity, that we're in a pretty good position. I believe that, because the Constitution, in its inherent inner self, it is a remarkable document that keeps us balanced and true, and it does not allow for a single group to completely control us or for a slide into dictatorship. And all of the anger and bleeding and constant raucous lamentations aside, I think it's still there. It's like a rock. If it begins to erode, well, that's something else. So yeah, Rome had that too, and the belief in Romanitas,
Yes.
and it kept Rome going, and it kept Rome going for 1,500 years, in spite of the fact that it no longer was an oligarchic republic and it became an empire. It had a vital center. It had a constitutional vision, and we have to maintain that. And if we do, well, we're probably going to be around for a while.
Where would you put the new capital? Like, where's our
Rome, in the amazing prescience and wisdom of Constantine, understood after all of the traumas of the 3rd century that, well, hey, Constantinople, we can survive there no matter what happens, and they did. But we haven't gone through a crisis of the 3rd century. That may happen. Yeah. And you remember, Rome fell in the 3rd century, and Romans put it back together, and then it survived for another 1,200 years. So we're not there yet. We're not at that big moment of crisis. But if it does come to that, I don't know.
I'm
St. Louis.
that we can't see the 22nd century. We have limits. We don't know why we can see the 21st. We're going to say that this is our ambition, that America's empire enjoys the same run that the Roman Empire does. The theater's closed for summertime, so we're going to sacrifice to Augustus and go on to our gardens. This is Germanicus, Michael Vlahos, Gaius, John Batchelor. The centurions are pleased. They want to hear more about Vietnam. And this fellow, Lyndon Johnson, they're curious. He was an emperor? Yes, well, all right. Those were the days when we went along with characters like Johnson. Maybe we will again. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.